12:42 in the afternoon, 20th of July, 1944. The stillness of the East Prussian forest shatters. A thunderous explosion rips through Conference Room 2 at the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler's heavily fortified military headquarters. Flames shoot through shattered windows. Smoke billows into the summer sky. Bodies fly through the air like broken dolls. Inside, through the choking black smoke and splintered wood, men scream. The conference table, thick Prussian oak, lies twisted and torn. Hitler's trousers are blown to ribbons. His hair smolders. But impossibly, unbelievably, the Führer staggers to his feet. 4 men will die from this blast. But Adolf Hitler, the man who has plunged the world into the bloodiest conflict in human history, survives. A German colonel has just attempted to assassinate the dictator of the Third Reich. His name is Claus von Stauffenberg. And this is the story of how the most audacious plot to kill Hitler came within inches of changing the course of World War II. The plan had been meticulous. The conspirators had worked for months. They had modified an existing military contingency plan, Operation Valkyrie, into an instrument of revolution. They had recruited generals, colonels, and commanders across the Reich. They had placed men in Paris, in Berlin, in Munich. Everything depended on one man carrying a British-made bomb into Hitler's presence. Everything depended on one man having the courage to become Germany's savior or its most notorious traitor. That man was 36 years old, an aristocrat, a Catholic, a career officer who had once believed in Hitler's promise to restore German greatness. But Claus von Stauffenberg had seen too much. He had witnessed the murders in Poland. He had watched the systematic starvation of Soviet prisoners. He had heard the reports of mass shootings in the East. By the summer of 1944, this decorated officer had decided that killing Hitler was not just permissible, it was his sacred duty. But how does a man like Stauffenberg, raised in privilege, trained in obedience, sworn by a personal oath to the Führer himself, become an assassin? The transformation did not happen overnight. Klaus Philipp Maria Justinian Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, was born on the 15th of November, 1907, in the family castle at Jettingen, Bavaria. His lineage stretched back centuries. His father served as the last Oberhof Marshal, the highest court official of the Kingdom of Württemberg. Among his ancestors was August von Gneisenau, the legendary field marshal who had fought Napoleon alongside Blücher. Stauffenberg was nobility in the oldest sense, not the pompous kind who collected titles, but the kind who understood nobility as service, as duty, as sacrifice. He grew up tall and strikingly handsome, with a resemblance so marked to the famous 13th century statue in Bamberg Cathedral that friends called him the Bamberger Reiter. Dark hair, piercing eyes, a bearing that commanded attention without demanding it. His education was classical, rigorous, Catholic. The Eberhard Ludwig Grammar School in Stuttgart taught him Latin, Greek, the great works of Western civilization. But it was the poetry of Stefan George that truly shaped him. George, the mysterious, charismatic poet who gathered brilliant young men into his circle, spoke of a secret Germany, a spiritual nation that existed beyond politics, beyond the corruption of modernity. George's verses preached sacrifice, nobility, and the supremacy of the spirit over the masses. Stauffenberg absorbed these ideas like oxygen. He could recite George's poems from memory. When he needed to recruit someone into the conspiracy, he would quote from the Antichrist, George's apocalyptic vision of a false leader who would lead Germany to ruin. The poet had died in 1933, the very year Hitler seized power, but his words echoed in Stauffenberg's mind like prophecy, like warning. In 1926, at age 19, Stauffenberg joined the 17th Bamberg Cavalry Regiment, following the path generations of his family had walked before him. The cavalry, ancient, traditional, honorable. But this was the 20th century, and cavalry was becoming obsolete. Tanks, aircraft, mechanized warfare, these were the tools of modern conflict. Stauffenberg adapted. He was no hidebound traditionalist clinging to the past. He understood that Germany's army must modernize, or perish. He studied at the War Academy in Berlin. By 1938, he had been assigned to the General Staff of the 1st Light Division under General Erich Hübner, a position that marked him as a rising star. The Wehrmacht's brightest young officers went to the General Staff. It was the brain of the German military machine. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Stauffenberg, like millions of Germans, felt a surge of hope. Here was a leader who rejected the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. Here was a man who promised to restore German pride after the catastrophe of the Great War and the chaos of the Weimar Republic, the unemployment, the hyperinflation, the shame. Hitler vowed to end it all, and he did. The economy recovered. Germans went back to work. The military expanded. For a young officer like Stauffenberg, trained to serve his country, Hitler's early years seemed to validate the gamble. One friend later recalled that Stauffenberg was delighted that the people rose up against the chains of the Versailles Treaty. Another remembered that he believed Hitler, despite all the low qualities in his nature, had expressed fundamental truths about German renewal. But the honeymoon did not last. Stauffenberg was no fool. He was educated, thoughtful, and deeply moral. As the 1930s progressed, he watched Hitler's regime reveal its true nature. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 legalized persecution of Jews. Kristallnacht, in November 1938, the night of broken glass, saw Jewish businesses smashed, synagogues burned, thousands arrested. Stauffenberg was appalled. This was not honor. This was barbarism. Yet he did not yet contemplate treason. Not yet. He believed, hoped, that the regime might moderate, that the excesses were temporary, that decent men within the system could steer Germany away from catastrophe. Then came war. In September 1939, German forces invaded Poland. Stauffenberg's unit participated in the campaign. The Polish army, brave but hopelessly outmatched, collapsed in weeks. But what followed the military victory horrified Stauffenberg. He witnessed the treatment of Polish civilians, the mass arrests, the deportations, the casual brutality. The SS and security police units that followed the army committed atrocities that made a mockery of military honor. Stauffenberg's uncle, Nicholas von Uexküll-Gyllenbond, was the first to approach him about resistance. But Stauffenberg was not ready, not quite. He still believed in Germany. He still believed in duty. He still believed, perhaps, that things might somehow improve. In May 1940, Germany invaded France. Stauffenberg distinguished himself as a staff officer in the campaign that stunned the world. France, the great military power that had fought Germany to a standstill in the trenches of the Great War, fell in 6 weeks. It seemed impossible. It was Germany's greatest military triumph since the days of Bismarck and Moltke. For his service, Stauffenberg received the Iron Cross First Class on the 31st of May, 1940. But even in victory, he felt uneasy. Hitler was becoming more erratic, more grandiose. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's crusade to destroy Bolshevism and seize Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Stauffenberg was assigned to Army High Command headquarters. From this vantage point, he saw the reports that never reached the German public. Reports of mass shootings, reports of SS Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, murdering Jews, communists, and intellectuals by the tens of thousands behind the advancing front. In the summer of 1942, Stauffenberg was stationed at headquarters in Vinnytsia, Ukraine. There, he learned the full scale of the horror. A fellow officer later testified that Stauffenberg expressed outrage and shock when discussing the treatment of Jews. Another witness, Major Joachim Kuhn, claimed that Stauffenberg told him in August 1942, "They are shooting Jews in masses. These crimes must not be allowed to continue." By this point, something had broken inside Stauffenberg. The scales had fallen from his eyes. This was not a regime that could be reformed. This was not a government that could be reasoned with. This was evil, and it must be destroyed. In September 1942, Stauffenberg declared to close associates that he was prepared to kill Hitler himself. But declaring readiness and finding opportunity are different things. Hitler had become increasingly paranoid. He rarely appeared in public. He spent most of his time at heavily guarded headquarters, the Wolfschanze, in East Prussia, the Berghof in Bavaria. He surrounded himself with SS bodyguards who trusted no one. His schedule changed without warning. Multiple previous attempts to kill him had failed. Some conspirators had lost their nerve. Others had been thwarted by circumstance. The Gestapo was closing in, arresting people on the fringes of the resistance. Time was running out. Germany was losing the war. The Allies had landed in Normandy. The Red Army was steamrolling through the east. If Hitler was not removed soon, Germany would be utterly destroyed. This was the reality that consumed Stauffenberg in 1943. Then came North Africa. In early 1943, Stauffenberg requested transfer to a combat posting. He was sent to Tunisia to serve as operations officer for the 10th Panzer Division, part of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps. The Germans were fighting a desperate rearguard action against overwhelming Allied forces. On the 7th of April, 1943, Stauffenberg was traveling by vehicle between units near Medzuna, south of Sebket on Nual, in the North African desert. Without warning, Allied fighter planes, P-40 Kitty Hawks of the Desert Air Force, likely from No. 3 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, screamed down out of the sky. Machine guns chattered. Bullets and cannon shells tore through the vehicle column. Men died instantly. Others were horribly wounded. Stauffenberg's body was riddled with shrapnel. His face was torn. Both hands were shattered. His left knee was smashed. He was evacuated to Munich, to the hospital of Professor Ferdinand Sauerbruch, one of Germany's most renowned surgeons. The wounds were catastrophic. Surgeons had to amputate Stauffenberg's entire right hand and forearm. They removed the 4th and 5th fingers from his left hand. His left eye was so badly damaged, it had to be removed. For weeks, he feared he might lose his sight entirely. He feared he might never walk properly again. But Stauffenberg possessed iron will. Within weeks, he had learned to dress himself with his remaining hand. He taught himself to write with 3 fingers. He joked to friends that he had never known what to do with so many fingers anyway. But beneath the gallows humor was fury. Fury at a regime that had led Germany into this catastrophe. Fury at a dictator whose megalomania was devouring the nation. For his wounds, he received the Wound Badge in gold on the 14th of April, 1943. For his courage, the German Cross in gold on the 8th of May. But awards meant nothing now. During his convalescence at Schloss Lautlingen, the family estate in southern Germany, Stauffenberg made his final decision. Hitler must die, and he, Claus von Stauffenberg, would be the one to kill him. By autumn 1943, Stauffenberg had recovered enough to return to duty. His doctors and family pleaded with him to rest longer, to accept medical retirement. But Stauffenberg refused. He understood what his injuries meant. They were his key to Hitler's presence. A decorated, mutilated war hero, the kind of officer Hitler loved to display as proof of German sacrifice, would not be searched, would not be suspected. His missing hand, his eye patch, his scarred face, these were his disguise. In October 1943, Stauffenberg was appointed to a staff position with the replacement army, the Ersatzheer, headquartered on Bendlerstrasse in Berlin. His commanding officer was General Friedrich Olbricht, a member of the resistance. Olbricht introduced Stauffenberg to the conspiracy's inner circle. Here, Stauffenberg met the other key plotters, General Henning von Treschow, the brilliant staff officer who had been working on assassination plans since 1942, General Ludwig Beck, former chief of the General Staff, who had resigned in protest of Hitler's aggressive war plans in 1938, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, Major General Hans Oster. These men represented the best of the old German officer corps, educated, principled, horrified by Nazism. They shared with Stauffenberg the plan they had been developing, Operation Valkyrie. The name came from Richard Wagner's opera Die Walküre, the Valkyries, mythological female warriors who carried fallen heroes to Valhalla. But the real Operation Valkyrie was not myth. It was an official contingency plan authorized by Hitler himself. The plan's stated purpose was to maintain order in the event of a breakdown in civil authority, if Allied bombing caused chaos, if foreign slave laborers revolted, if the Nazi Party attempted a coup. In such emergencies, the replacement army would mobilize, occupy key government buildings, communication centers, and concentration camps. and restore order. It was a sensible precaution. What Hitler did not know was that the resistance had secretly modified Valkyrie. General Olbricht had added supplementary sections. Major General Tresckow had expanded it further in August and September 1943. The modified orders called for the disarmament and arrest of the SS, the occupation of radio stations, the neutralization of Gestapo headquarters, the arrest of Nazi party leaders. All written information was handled by Treskow's wife, Erika, and his secretary, Margaret von Oven. Both women wore gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. The modified Valkyrie plan began with a false declaration. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, is dead. A treacherous group of party leaders has attempted to exploit the situation by attacking our embattled soldiers from the rear to seize power for themselves. This premise was crucial. The rank-and-file soldiers of the replacement army were loyal to Hitler. They would never cooperate with a coup against him, but they would act to defend him or avenge him. The conspirators calculated that if soldiers believed Hitler was dead and that the SS had killed him to seize power, they would follow orders to arrest SS leaders and secure the Reich. The beauty of Valkyrie was that it turned loyalty to Hitler into the weapon that would destroy his regime. Once the SS was disarmed and Nazi leaders arrested, the conspirators could reveal the truth, form a new government, and negotiate peace with the Western Allies before the Red Army reached Germany's borders. But there was one enormous problem. Only 2 men could activate Operation Valkyrie. One was Hitler himself. The other was Colonel General Friedrich Fromm, Commander-in-Chief of the replacement army. Fromm was not a conspirator. He was a careerist, ambitious, cautious, loyal to whoever held power. He knew vaguely that conspiracies existed. He had not reported them, but he had not joined them either. He was waiting to see which side would win. The conspirators had to either win Fromm over or neutralize him when the moment came. And the moment depended entirely on one thing. Hitler had to be killed, not arrested, not injured, killed, dead beyond doubt. Because every officer and soldier in the Wehrmacht had sworn a personal oath to Adolf Hitler, the Reichswehrrede, the oath of loyalty, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, to Hitler personally. That oath was sacred to German officers. It could not be broken while Hitler lived. Death, only death, would release them. This was the terrible calculus facing Stauffenberg. Multiple other officers had been considered as the assassin. General Helmuth Stieff, Chief of Organization and Army High Command, had volunteered but later backed down. Tresckow himself had tried repeatedly to get close enough to Hitler without success. Others had lost their nerve when the moment came. By mid-1944, the conspirators were desperate. The Gestapo was arresting people on the periphery of the plot. The Red Army was destroying Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. The Americans and British had landed in Normandy. Germany was being crushed between 2 advancing armies. If the coup did not happen soon, there would be nothing left to save. In July 1944, Stauffenberg was promoted to full colonel and appointed Chief of Staff to the Replacement Army Command under General Fromm. This position changed everything. As Chief of Staff, Stauffenberg had regular access to Hitler's military conferences. He would attend situation briefings at the Wolfschanze in East Prussia or at the Berghof in Bavaria. He would stand in the same room as the Führer. He would be close enough to kill him. But this created a terrible dilemma. Stauffenberg was the one conspirator with both access to Hitler and authority within the replacement army. If he was the assassin, he would have to plant the bomb, escape, and fly back to Berlin to direct the coup. The coup depended on swift, decisive action in the hours immediately after Hitler's death. Orders had to be transmitted. Units had to be mobilized. Nazi leaders had to be arrested before they realized what was happening. If Stauffenberg was not in Berlin to direct operations, who would? General Olbricht lacked the decisiveness. General Beck was too old and too cautious. None of the other conspirators had Stauffenberg's force of personality, his ability to inspire men to act. It was an impossible situation. Stauffenberg would have to be in 2 places at once. He would have to plant the bomb at the Wolfschanze, escape, fly 3 hours back to Berlin, and somehow make up for lost time. Every minute of delay would give Hitler's supporters time to respond, to regain control, to crush the coup. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to fail. Yet Stauffenberg accepted the task. On the 14th of July, 1944, he was quoted as saying, The worst thing is knowing that we cannot succeed, and yet that we have to do it for our country and our children. This was not confidence. This was resolve, duty, sacrifice. The aristocratic code Stauffenberg had absorbed since childhood. Even if the plot failed, even if it led to his death, it had to be attempted. Germany's honor demanded it. Thousands of lives demanded it. History demanded it. Stauffenberg made his first attempt on the 11th of July. He attended a conference at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat near Berchtesgaden, with a bomb in his briefcase. But Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring were not present. The conspirators had decided that Hitler, Himmler, and Göring, the three most powerful men in the Nazi regime, should all be killed together. Stauffenberg could not detonate the bomb with only Hitler present. He aborted. 4 days later, on the 15th of July, Stauffenberg flew to the Wolfschanze with Captain Friedrich Karl Klausing, a fellow conspirator. Again, he carried a bomb. Again, Himmler was absent. Stauffenberg reported this to Berlin. The senior conspirators, Beck, Ulbricht, Gordeler, ordered him to abort, but Stauffenberg and his close friend, Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quernheim, had agreed in secret to proceed anyway, to detonate the bomb, regardless of who was present. When Stauffenberg returned to the briefing room after arming the device, he found the meeting had been rescheduled. The opportunity was gone. The bomb was disarmed. Stauffenberg flew back to Berlin, having failed twice. Time was running out. The Gestapo was circling. People were being arrested. The risk of exposure grew with every passing day. One more attempt. That was all they had left. One more chance to kill Hitler and save Germany. July 20th, 1944. A hot, humid summer day in East Prussia. Stauffenberg flew to the Wolfschanze with his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften. In his briefcase, he carried a British-made bomb, 1 kilogram of plastic explosive with a pencil timer that would detonate 10 minutes after activation. The device had been captured by German forces and modified by the resistance. Appropriately, a British weapon would be used to kill the German dictator. The Wolfschanze was Hitler's most important headquarters. He had spent over 800 days there, more time than at any other location during the war. The complex was buried deep in the Masurian forests, near the village of Görlitz, about 8 kilometers east of Rastenburg. It consisted of dozens of buildings, command bunkers, guest houses, barracks, communication centers, all camouflaged with trees and netting to make it invisible from the air. 3 security zones surrounded the complex, guarded by SS units and military police. Every person entering was checked, their credentials verified, their purpose questioned. But Stauffenberg was expected. He was chief of staff to the replacement army commander. He was a decorated war hero. He was mutilated in service to the Reich. No one suspected. The Situation Conference was scheduled for 12:30 in the afternoon. Originally, it was to be held in the underground Führer bunker, a concrete fortress deep beneath the earth, but the day was unbearably hot. The air in the underground bunker would be stifling. At the last minute, the meeting was moved above ground to the guest house, a wooden structure with large windows for ventilation. This change, unknown to Stauffenberg, would prove catastrophic. A bomb detonated in a sealed concrete bunker would kill everyone inside. The blast wave would have nowhere to escape. It would reflect off the walls, amplifying the destruction. But a bomb in a wooden building with windows would allow the blast to dissipate. Much of the force would escape through the walls and windows. The casualties would be far fewer. Stauffenberg did not know this. He could not know this. He proceeded with the plan. Shortly before 12:30, Stauffenberg asked permission to use a nearby washroom to freshen up and change his shirt. The heat was oppressive. This was the moment. In the washroom, with Haeften standing guard, Stauffenberg opened the briefcase and activated the pencil timer. The device was simple, a glass vial of acid that would slowly eat through a thin wire. When the wire broke, it would release a spring-loaded firing pin, which would strike a detonator, which would ignite the plastic explosive. 10 minutes. Stauffenberg had to crush the vial to start the acid, to start the clock. With his 3 remaining fingers, he squeezed. Suddenly, a knock on the door, a sergeant urging him to hurry. The meeting was about to begin. Stauffenberg had planned to arm 2 bombs for maximum destructive force. 2 kilograms of explosive instead of 1, but there was no time. Haften quickly gathered the second bomb while Stauffenberg closed the briefcase. The timer was running. 10 minutes, perhaps less. Stauffenberg walked back to the conference room carrying death in a leather case. The room was crowded. More than 20 officers and staff gathered around a large oak map table. Hitler stood near the middle of the table, hunched over military maps, examining the catastrophic situation on the Eastern Front. Army Group Center had been annihilated. The Red Army was racing toward the Reich. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, was presenting the latest intelligence. Stauffenberg entered quietly. He placed the briefcase under the table, as close to Hitler as he could manage without attracting attention. The briefcase rested against a thick, solid oak table leg. Stauffenberg then made a prearranged excuse. He had to take an urgent telephone call from Berlin. He stepped out of the room. The timer ticked down. Inside the conference room, Colonel Heinz Brandt, Hitler's deputy chief of operations, found the briefcase in his way. He needed to lean closer to the map. The briefcase was awkward, blocking his view. Without thinking, Brandt pushed the briefcase farther under the table, moving it to the far side of the massive oak support leg. The leg, thick, solid, immovable, now stood between the bomb and Hitler. Stauffenberg walked quickly away from the guest house. He glanced at his watch. Any second now. A few hundred meters away, General Erich Feldgiebel, the communications chief and a conspirator, waited anxiously. The plan required Feldgiebel to cut all telephone and radio communications from the Wolfschanze immediately after the explosion, to prevent Hitler's supporters from learning what had happened, from organizing a response. Everything depended on speed, on confusion, on the brief window of chaos. Stauffenberg reached a safe distance. He waited, and then, at precisely 12:42, the bomb detonated. The explosion was massive, a thunderclap that echoed through the forest. Flames shot from the windows of the guest house. The roof partially collapsed. Smoke poured into the sky. Stauffenberg saw a body being carried out on a stretcher, covered in a blanket. Hitler had to be dead. No one could have survived that blast. Stauffenberg and Haften immediately ran to their waiting staff car. They had to escape the compound, reach the airfield, fly to Berlin. Every second counted, but getting out of the Wolfschanze was not simple. 3 security checkpoints stood between Stauffenberg and freedom. At the first checkpoint, Stauffenberg calmly presented his credentials and explained he had urgent business in Berlin. The guards, confused by the explosion, hesitated. Stauffenberg's rank, his bearing, his war wounds, all lent authority. The guards waved him through. At the second checkpoint, the same. But at the third, the guards had received orders. No one was to leave. The compound was locked down. Stauffenberg did not panic. He calmly telephoned a senior officer at headquarters and ordered the checkpoint opened. The guards, faced with conflicting orders from senior officers, chose to obey the colonel standing in front of them. The barrier lifted. Stauffenberg's car sped toward the airfield. Minutes later, the Heinkel H-111 aircraft, arranged by General Eduard Wagner, lifted off. Stauffenberg was airborne, flying toward Berlin, convinced that Adolf Hitler was dead. He had done it. The tyrant was dead. Germany could be saved. But inside the shattered conference room at the Wolfschanze, something impossible had happened. Through the smoke and splintered wood, figures stirred. Hitler staggered to his feet. His hair was singed. His trousers were blown to tatters. His right arm hung useless, temporarily paralyzed. Both eardrums were damaged, a perforation that would leave him with balance problems for the rest of his life. But he was alive. The heavy oak table leg had absorbed much of the blast. The open windows had allowed the pressure wave to dissipate. 4 men were dead or dying. Heinz Brandt, the officer who had moved the briefcase, was mortally wounded. General Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's chief adjutant, would die from his wounds. General Günther Korten, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, would not survive. A stenographer named Heinrich Berger died that afternoon. Others were seriously injured, blown through windows, burned, lacerated by shrapnel. But Adolf Hitler, the primary target, had survived. He walked out of the ruins under his own power. Within minutes, the word spread through the Wolf's Lair. The Führer lives. General Feldgiebel faced an agonizing choice. He had seen the explosion. He believed Hitler was dead. According to the plan, he should immediately cut all communications. But when he entered the conference room, he saw Hitler alive, being attended by doctors. The plan had failed. Feldgiebel did the only thing he could. He telephoned General Olbricht in Berlin and delivered a cryptic, garbled message. The bomb had exploded. Hitler had survived, or had he? The message was unclear. Then Feldgiebel tried to cut communication, but it was too late. Other officers had already telephoned Berlin, reporting that the Führer was alive. The critical minutes of confusion that the conspirators needed, minutes when they could have seized control before anyone knew what was happening, evaporate. But Feldgiebel's message had not reached Stauffenberg. The colonel was in the air, flying back to Berlin, unreachable, still believing Hitler was dead. Back at Bendler Block headquarters in Berlin, the conspirators were paralyzed by uncertainty. Was Hitler dead? Feldgiebel's message was ambiguous. Some reports said Hitler was alive. Others said he was dead. What should they do? General Olbricht wanted to launch Valkyrie immediately, but without confirmation of Hitler's death, he hesitated. Every minute of delay reduced their chances of success. Finally, around 1 o'clock, Olbricht decided to issue preliminary orders. He told replacement army units to prepare for mobilization, but he did not yet give the full Valkyrie order. He was waiting for Stauffenberg, waiting for certainty. The minutes ticked by. 1:30, 2 o'clock, 2:30, nothing. Then, around 4 o'clock, Stauffenberg's aircraft landed at Rangsdorf Airfield near Berlin. Stauffenberg immediately telephoned Bendler Block. Hitler was dead, he insisted. He had seen the explosion. No one could have survived. Launch Valkyrie immediately, now. Olbricht, reassured by Stauffenberg's confidence, issued the orders. But it was too late. 3.5 hours had passed since the explosion. 3.5 hours during which Hitler's supporters had consolidated control, during which the truth had spread. The Führer was alive. At 5 o'clock, Stauffenberg reached the Bendler Block in person. He burst into the headquarters, full of energy and conviction. Hitler is dead, he declared. I saw it myself. We must act now. The other conspirators were less certain. Reports kept arriving that Hitler was alive. Stauffenberg refused to believe them. Lies, he said. Propaganda. The SS trying to prevent the coup. Ignore them. Proceed with the plan. For a few hours, the conspirators tried. Valkyrie orders went out to military districts across Germany. In Paris, General Karl Heinrich von Stauffenberg successfully disarmed and arrested the SS and Gestapo leadership in France. In Vienna, in Prague, in other cities, some units mobilized. But in Berlin, the heart of the Reich, where control mattered most, everything went wrong. General Friedrich Fromm, the commander-in-chief of the replacement army, was supposed to either join the coup or be neutralized. When Olbricht tried to win him over, Fromm telephoned Keitel at the Wolfschanze. Is the Führer alive? Keitel confirmed that Hitler had survived. Fromm immediately refused to cooperate. He tried to arrest the conspirators. Instead, they arrested him, locking him in an office. General Erich Hübner, a conspirator, assumed command, but Hübner lacked Fromm's authority. Many officers refused to obey orders from someone they did not recognize as legitimate. Meanwhile, Major Otto Ernst Riemer, commander of the Grossdeutschland Guard Battalion in Berlin, received orders to occupy key government buildings and arrest Nazi party leaders. Riemer, a loyal Nazi, was confused. He went to the propaganda ministry to arrest Joseph Goebbels. But Goebbels was ready. He telephoned Hitler. Would Riemer like to speak to the Führer personally? Riemer came to the phone. Hitler's voice, unmistakable, commanding, came through the line. The Führer was alive. The coup was treason. Riemer was to arrest the conspirators immediately. Riemer obeyed. Within minutes, the coup in Berlin was unraveling. By 10 o'clock that evening, it was over. Fromm, freed by officers loyal to Hitler, regained control of the Bendler Block. He was in a desperate situation. He had known about the conspiracy, but had not reported it. If the conspirators talked, they could implicate him. The only way to save himself was to silence them immediately. Fromm convened an impromptu court-martial. The sentence was already decided: death. Shortly before midnight, Stauffenberg, General Olbricht, Colonel Mertz von Quernheim, and Lieutenant von Haften were led out to the courtyard of the Bendler Block. The courtyard was dark. A truck's headlights provided illumination. A makeshift firing squad assembled. Stauffenberg stood straight, his silhouette stark against the light. He knew this moment would come. He had prepared for it. As the firing squad raised their rifles, Stauffenberg shouted 3 words into the night. "Long live sacred Germany!" The shots rang out. Stauffenberg fell, then Haften, then Ulbricht, then Merz von Quernheim. 4 men dead in less than 5 minutes. Fromm had silenced the principal witnesses, but his desperate gambit would not save him. Heinrich Himmler would later have him executed anyway for his passive knowledge of the plot. The bodies of the conspirators were buried hastily in a nearby courtyard. The next day, on Hitler's orders, they were exhumed, cremated, and their ashes scattered so that no shrine could be erected to their memory. But why did the plot fail? How did a plan so carefully constructed, so meticulously prepared, collapse so completely? The answer lies in a series of small, terrible accidents, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a chain of catastrophe. First, the location change. The conference was moved from the concrete Führer bunker to the wooden guest house. In the bunker, the blast would have been contained, amplified, deadly. In the wooden structure, the explosion vented through windows and walls, dissipating its force. This single change, made for comfort in hot weather, saved Hitler's life. Second, Colonel Brandt moving the briefcase. Stauffenberg had positioned it as close to Hitler as possible, but when Brandt found it obstructing his view of the maps, he pushed it to the far side of the massive oak table leg. That leg, thick, solid, immovable, absorbed much of the blast intended for Hitler. The shock wave that should have killed the Führer instead killed Brandt himself. Third, Stauffenberg's injuries prevented him from arming both bombs. With 2 functioning hands, he could have prepared 2 kilograms of explosive instead of 1, double the blast, double the chance of success. But his war wounds made the task impossible in the time available. The sergeant knocking on the washroom door, urging haste, eliminated any possibility of arming the second device. Fourth, the 3.5-hour delay. Stauffenberg had to be at the Wolfschanze to plant the bomb and in Berlin to direct the coup. No other conspirator could fulfill both roles. But those 3.5 hours, the time it took to escape the compound, reach the airfield, fly to Berlin, and drive to headquarters, were fatal. In that time, Hitler's supporters learned he was alive. They consolidated control. They issued counter-orders. The window of confusion closed. Fifth, the ambiguous message from Feldgiebel. If Feldgiebel had clearly stated that Hitler was alive, the conspirators could have aborted, destroyed evidence, fled. If he had clearly stated Hitler was dead, they could have launched Valkyrie with full confidence and speed. Instead, his cryptic message left them paralyzed by uncertainty, hesitating when decisiveness was everything. Sixth, Fromm's refusal to cooperate. If the commander-in-chief of the replacement army had joined the conspiracy, or even remained neutral, Valkyrie would have proceeded with legitimate authority. Officers across Germany would have obeyed without question. But Fromm's telephone call to Keitel, confirming Hitler's survival, gave wavering officers an excuse to refuse orders. Seventh, Major Reimer's direct contact with Hitler. If Reimer had simply followed orders and arrested Nazi leaders as instructed, the coup might have gained momentum before countermeasures could be organized. But Goebbels' quick thinking, putting Hitler on the telephone, transformed Reimer from a potential instrument of the coup into its nemesis. Eighth, the geographic dispersal of conspirators. The plot relied on simultaneous action across Germany and occupied territories. But coordination was difficult, communication was slow. Some conspirators acted decisively, like Stülpnagel in Paris, who successfully arrested the SS. Others hesitated, others refused. The lack of unified, simultaneous action meant that Hitler's supporters could defeat the coup piecemeal, city by city, unit by unit. Ninth, the oath. The Reichswehrrede, the personal oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler, was a psychological chain that most officers could not break. Even officers who hated Hitler, who knew Germany was losing the war, who understood the regime's criminality, could not bring themselves to violate their sacred oath. They had sworn before God. For men raised in the Prussian military tradition, an oath was inviolable. This was why Hitler had to die. Only death could release officers from their oath. But Hitler survived, and the oath remained binding. Many officers who might have supported the coup if Hitler were dead refused to act when they learned he lived. Tenth, and perhaps most fundamentally, the conspirators were military men, not revolutionaries. They believed in order, in hierarchy, in following proper procedures. Even in their coup attempt, they tried to work through official channels. They modified an existing plan rather than creating something entirely new. They relied on the chain of command rather than direct action. This was their strength, their legitimacy, their credibility, but also their fatal weakness. Revolutions require ruthlessness, speed, and a willingness to act without authorization. The conspirators had courage, but not the instinct for power that successful coups require. What if the plot had succeeded? What if the table leg had not shielded Hitler? What if both bombs had detonated? What if Stauffenberg had been in Berlin to direct operations from the start? The history of the 20th century might have been radically different. Germany would have been plunged into civil war. The Wehrmacht, suddenly freed from their oath, would have split. Some units would have supported the new government. Others would have remained loyal to the Nazi regime or to the idea of the Nazi regime, even with Hitler dead. The SS, with its own divisions and fanatical loyalty to Hitler, would have fought. Himmler commanded significant military forces. Goebbels controlled the propaganda apparatus. A power struggle would have erupted while Allied armies advanced from both east and west. The conspirators planned to open negotiations with the Western Allies. They hoped to preserve German territorial integrity, to prevent Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, to achieve a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to survive as a nation-state. But would the Allies have negotiated? By July 1944, the Allied strategy was clear: unconditional surrender, no negotiations, no separate peace. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had agreed at Casablanca in January 1943 that Germany must surrender completely and submit to occupation. The conspirators' hope that the Western Allies would treat a post-Hitler Germany differently was probably naive. The Allies had no reason to trust any German government, no matter who led it. The crimes of the Nazi regime were too vast, too well documented. The Allies wanted Germany defeated, occupied, denazified, and permanently prevented from waging aggressive war. A military coup replacing Hitler with a junta of generals would not have changed Allied war aims. Still, a successful coup might have shortened the war by weeks or months. It might have prevented the final, apocalyptic destruction of German cities. It might have saved thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives. The last 9 months of World War II in Europe were among the most destructive. The Battle of the Bulge, the firebombing of Dresden, the final defense of Berlin, the death marches from concentration camps. All of this occurred after July 20th, 1944. If Hitler had died that day, some of this might have been avoided, but Hitler did not die. He survived, and his survival doomed the conspirators. In the weeks and months following the 20th of July, Hitler unleashed a wave of terror, unprecedented, even by Nazi standards. The Gestapo arrested thousands. Anyone with even the slightest connection to the resistance was hunted down. Confessions were extracted under torture. Names led to more names. The conspiracy, it turned out, was vast. Generals, colonels, diplomats, civil servants, aristocrats, lawyers, priests, hundreds of people had known, or should have known, or might have known. The regime's paranoia consumed innocent and guilty alike. Approximately 200 people were executed in direct connection with the July 20th plot. Another 5,000 were arrested. Many were tortured. Some were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks. Hitler personally ordered that the executions be filmed so he could watch them later. The conspiracy included some of Germany's most distinguished families: the von Stauffenberg family, the von Treschow family, the von Moltke family. Names that had served Prussia and Germany for centuries were now synonymous with treason. Count Peter York von Wartenberg, hanged. Julius Leber, executed. Karl Friedrich Gordeler, former mayor of Leipzig, who was to have been chancellor in the new government, hanged. General Friedrich Olbricht, executed by firing squad the same night as Stauffenberg. General Henning von Treschow, the brilliant strategist who had expanded the Valkyrie plan, committed suicide on the Eastern Front when he learned the plot had failed. He walked into no man's land with a grenade and blew himself up, making it appear he had died in combat. General Ludwig Beck, the former chief of the general staff, who was to have been head of state, attempted suicide in the Bendler block but botched it. He had to be finished off by a sergeant. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, hanged. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr military intelligence, imprisoned for months, then executed. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian and pastor, hanged just weeks before the war's end. The purge extended to families. Sippenhaft, blood guilt. The Nazis arrested the wives, children, parents, brothers, and sisters of the conspirators. Claus von Stauffenberg's wife, Nina, was arrested and imprisoned. His brother Berthold, also a conspirator, was executed. His children were taken into state custody, their names changed, to prevent them from honoring their father's memory. The officer corps, the last institution in Germany with any independence from the Nazi Party, was thoroughly broken. Hitler forced all officers to give the Nazi salute instead of the traditional military salute. He demanded that officers swear new oaths of loyalty, more extreme than before. He placed Nazi commissars in military units to ensure ideological reliability. The Wehrmacht, which had once maintained some distance from the party, was now fully Nazified. The failure of the plot ensured that Germany would fight to the bitter end. No armistice, no negotiation, no surrender until the country was utterly destroyed. For 9 more months, the war continued. Millions more died. Allied bombers reduced German cities to rubble. Soviet forces raped and murdered their way through eastern Germany. The concentration camps continued their work until the very end. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The death marches, as the SS evacuated camps ahead of Allied advances, killed tens of thousands more. The Battle of Berlin in April and early May 1945 killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians. All of this might have been prevented if Stauffenberg's bomb had killed Hitler on the 20th of July. But was the plot a failure? Militarily, yes. It did not kill Hitler. It did not end the war. It did not prevent Germany's total destruction. But morally, historically, the significance is different. The resistance proved that not all Germans supported Hitler. It demonstrated that men of conscience existed within the German military and civil service. It showed that some people were willing to sacrifice everything, their careers, their families, their lives, to oppose evil. In the decades after the war, the German resistance became a source of pride, a counterpoint to the shame of Nazi crimes. Streets, schools, and military installations were named after Stauffenberg and his fellow conspirators. The Bendler Block, where they died, became a memorial site. The question of whether the conspirators were heroes or traitors was gradually resolved in their favor. They had acted not out of disloyalty to Germany, but out of loyalty to a higher Germany, the secret Germany of Stefan George's poetry, a Germany of honor, justice, and morality that the Nazi regime had betrayed. Yet even their heroism is complicated. Many of the conspirators had initially supported Hitler. They had fought his wars. They had participated, directly or indirectly, in the regime's crimes. Stauffenberg himself had witnessed atrocities in Poland and Russia, but continued to serve. Some historians argue that the conspirators turned against Hitler not because of moral outrage over the Holocaust, but because Germany was losing the war. They wanted to preserve Germany's position as a great power, to prevent total defeat and occupation. Their plan to negotiate with the Western Allies while excluding the Soviet Union was based on preserving German influence in Eastern Europe, the very territories Hitler had invaded. Were they resisting Hitler's policies or merely his incompetence? Were they trying to save Germany or to save the German military elite's position and privilege? These questions have no simple answers. The conspirators were not saints. They were flawed, complicated men living in a morally catastrophic situation, trying to do what they believed was right. What is beyond dispute is their courage. Stauffenberg, a 36-year-old colonel with a wife and 5 children, walked into Hitler's headquarters knowing he would probably not survive the day. He carried a bomb that could have exploded prematurely. He could have been searched. He could have been shot trying to escape. Even if the bomb killed Hitler, Stauffenberg knew the Gestapo would hunt him down. There was no escape plan beyond the immediate coup. If the coup failed, he would die. He accepted this. He told his brother Berthold, "It is now time that something was done." But the man who has the courage to do something must do it in the knowledge that he will go down in German history as a traitor. If he does not do it, however, he will be a traitor to his own conscience. This was the tragedy at the heart of the Valkyrie plot. The men who tried to save Germany from Hitler had to betray their oaths, their government, their Führer. They had to become what they had been trained all their lives never to become, rebels against lawful authority. For men raised in the Prussian tradition of duty and obedience, this was a terrible price.